Okay, so we covered breathing, which is really important, and I hope you've been practicing that, really noticing your tendencies when you breathe, if you're holding your breath at all during exertion or anything like that. So that's super important. Now we're going to go into a second factor that is also important when we move, and that factor is alignment or positioning, either one. So how we carry our body as we're moving, as we're exercising, even as we're walking or holding our babies, it matters. It is important. And while we don't want to strive for perfection, because that's impossible and it will drive you crazy if you're trying to be perfect in this all the time, we do really just want to be aware, and we want to know what's happening when we're in certain positions and postures and how to reduce those postures as much as possible. So when we talked about the core canister, okay, remember we're trying to avoid placing any additional stress on the abdominal wall or the transverse abdominis and on the pelvic floor, because those are muscle systems that are really vulnerable during pregnancy and postpartum. They've already gone through or are going through a lot of stress, have a lot of pressure placed on them, and we don't want to add to that. So the way that we're positioned actually can add stress and additional pressure, not just the way we breathe or not breathe, but even our position. So what we want to think about is having a nice neutral pelvis, which I'll show you in a second how you can really see and assess that for yourself and get into a more neutral position. And then we want our ribs to be stacked directly over the pelvis, okay? So I'm going to show you really quickly what I mean by that. Okay, so as you can see here, you can try this too, so you can go ahead and stand up and kind of play around with this, but I like to put my hands kind of on my hip bones right here. You can feel where those bony parts of your hips are. That's just going to help you feel where that pelvis is and what position it's in. Okay, so with your hands here, what we want to do is start to move the pelvis back and forth, so we want it to be kind of spilling forward and tucked under. And we want to go through that a few times. Now what I like to call this is minding your bowl. So you want to think of your pelvis as a bowl. It's kind of smaller at the bottom and really open at the top. And imagine that your bowl is filled with water. And what we want to do is get your bowl in a position where it's straight up and down and can hold the water in the bowl, okay? What we tend to do is we have a tendency to be really extended this way. So this is really common in pregnancy when you're later in pregnancy and you have a lot of weight right here. Our pelvis or our bowl is spilling that water forward. So you can see, like, when I have my hands here, they're really tilted forward, and that means that I tend to have this tilted forward position. Okay, now what this is going to do is place a lot of stress right here on the abdominal wall, because this is being more stretched out. You can kind of see how instead of here where there's more space, it's really being extended. Okay, so we really want to avoid that position, whether you're pregnant or postpartum. Sometimes when you're really late in pregnancy, you can't really avoid that, and that's just a position that you just have to get into, and it's okay. We don't have to be perfect, but especially if you're healing an abdominal separation after a baby, and you've been used to being this way for 9 months, then we really need to retrain our brains to not be in that position and instead to get a more neutral pelvis so that we're not placing more stress on this abdominal wall. Okay, so that's a really front-facing pelvis, okay? Then the other tendency, which this is also common, is to have your pelvis really tucked under like this. A lot of times this is when our shoulders are forward, and I actually see this a lot in postpartum moms because we've gotten so used to nursing our babies, holding them like this, sitting like this with our butt really tucked under, okay? And so you can think of your bowl as all that water spilling back when we're in this position, okay? And this is also really common. What this does is this turns off our glutes, and our glutes and our pelvic floor are BFFs, they're best friends, and so when we have good glute activation, we have good pelvic floor activation, and this position just doesn't really help our pelvic floor be able to readily turn on and off. So a lot of women experience leaking or pelvic floor issues like prolapse because of this position a lot. Okay, and so you can see both extremes. So if you kind of like go back and forth, you might feel which one's a little bit easier for you. Okay, so for me, this forward tilt is a lot easier. It's really hard for me to get into this back tilt. So that means this is probably my tendency. I'm pregnant right now, so that makes sense, especially right now. And so what you want to do is after you feel those two extremes, we just want to find a neutral position. We want you to get your weight in the midfoot, okay, so not really far back, not really far forward. That's going to affect your position. Think about really in the middle of your foot, and then just try to find just that upward position. So this is a neutral position for me. Then, so once we've dealt with our bulls, we want to think about our bells, which is our rib cage, okay? So same thing, we don't want our rib cage to be really flared out and our breast trajectory to be really up, okay? That's again going to place more stress on the abdominal wall, okay? At the same time, we don't want our rib cage really thrust back. We want that bell of the rib cage to be nice and neutral and really just stacked right over the hip. I like to say if you had a laser going straight from your sternum, so kind of that bone in your rib cage, right here under the chest, and then you had a laser going straight from your pelvis, the front of your pelvis, okay? You want them to be parallel from each other, okay? So you don't want them to, you know, cross right here, and you don't want them to be going opposite directions. You want to find a really good position where they're going parallel, okay? We want to try to maintain this position whenever we're doing exercise, and I'm just going to go over one exercise that we really see a lot of over flaring in the movement, and that is an overhead press. So what that looks like is when you're having something from your shoulders and you bring it straight overhead, okay? What we want to do is as we press up, we want to lock out the arms, but we want to keep a good position. A lot of times as we fatigue or if we're really weak, we tend to overcompensate by really thrusting our rib cage and using a lot of our back, okay? So you see how this is not a good position maybe if you are healing after baby or if you're pregnant. This is not going to really be helpful for our core and pelvic floor health, okay? So we really want to focus on something like this to get stacked as much as possible. Same thing when we're squatting, okay? We want to start in this position, we want to breathe through the movement, and we want to end in this position, okay? So that means at the top of the squat, you don't really have to tuck under a lot like this. So a lot of times I see women go down and tuck under, go down, tuck under. Okay, we don't need to do that. You might experiencing some leaking in your squat or some pain if you're doing that. And what you want to do is just think about just a gentle squeeze at the top, but you're not really tucking under. See, I'm still fully extended, but I'm just more stacked right here. So that's a little basics about alignment. This is something that we will be going over and covering in class, but I want you to really play around with that, especially with any overhead movement and as you squat, just making sure your ribs are stacked over the hips and that we're really not overextending or tucking under one way or the other.